Welcome everyone to the fifth and the last session of UNESCO's 50 for the next 50. My name is Matilda Machimura, and I will be your host for the next 2 hours. We gather here today to continue the historic celebration of the World Heritage Convention, which has turned 50 years old this year. Today's session is titled Towards a Balanced Representation of World Heritage Sites. Among us, we have community builders, indigenous leaders, and anthropological thinkers from diverse regions of the world, giving us a glimpse into the more inclusive vision of the next 50. I would like to also mention that the director of the World Heritage Center, Mr. Lazar, is here with us today. On this note, it is my pleasure to begin this session with the welcome remark by UNESCO's Assistant Director General for Culture, Mr. Ernesto Ottone.
Thank you, Matilda. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed thinkers, chers amis. Welcome everyone to the fifth and, as it was mentioned, last session of UNESCO's 50 Mind for the Next 50. This roundtable series is a key initiative within the 50th anniversary celebration of the World Heritage Convention. Today, the instantly recognizable World Heritage emblem represents more than the outstanding nature of a site that bears it. With near universal ratification by 194 countries, it symbolizes a promise made by the international community to protect heritage as our shared responsibility, regardless of where it may be. Les défis à relever sont nombreux. Les crises mondiales.
The challenges that we face are many. There are international conflicts that are also challenges such as climate change, excessive tourism, pandemics. This cannot be solved only by heritage experts, which is why over the past few months we launched an appeal, a call to find innovative solutions. We invited more than 50 brilliant minds or thinkers, architects, artists, chefs, adventurers. They have been a source of inspiration for the next 50 years. This innovative and interdisciplinary series ends today with a session that is called Towards a More Balanced Representation of World Heritage. This session
has challenged and enhanced the very notion of heritage. At the same time, the convention itself has evolved to reflect the full spectrum of world's diversity. The launch of the Global Strategy for a Representative, Balanced and Credible World Heritage List in '94 reflects this commitment. The strategy, which concluded in 2020, promoted, and I quote, the inscription of natural sites heavily outnumbered by cultural sites at the time, and improved geographical coverage due to the concentration of inscribed properties in developed countries' regions, notably Europe. But representation goes well beyond the properties and the system of inscription. It pertains to who is at the decision-making table. In the next 50 years, local communities and indigenous people must be given a seat and voice at the table, not only as stakeholders, but as the custodians and protagonists whose history, identity, livelihoods, and spiritually and tied to heritage over generations. Today, 10 thinkers represents such an essential perspective. Let us learn from storytellers, activists, indigenous leaders, and community builders from all corners of the world. On this note, it is my pleasure to announce the start of the fifth and last session of the 50 Mind for the next 50. Matilda, I give you the floor back. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Assistant Director General Ernesto Ottone, for these words that help us put today's conversation into context. Without further ado, let us begin. In order to spark a dynamic, truly interdisciplinary exchange, the discussions will be in adult formats. During each of the 5 sessions, two thinkers will explore the vision for the next 50. Our first are Ms. Mariam Kamara and Mr. Adrian Joe Milang. Ms. Mariam Kamara is a Nigerian architect and founder of Atelier Masomili. Her design focuses on open living spaces that serve and improve the lives of African communities. She works closely with local professionals and artisans and uses local building materials for sustainable solutions. Ms. Kamara is internationally recognized for her innovative architecture with local communities at heart. And Mr. Adrian Joe Milang is a musician and performer from the Kayan community, an indigenous tribe in central Borneo of Malaysia. He's one of the youngest practitioners of Parap and Takna, two oral traditions of the Kayan communities, which he started practicing when he was only 12 years old. Mr. Milang serves as a community manager at the Tuyang Initiative. He cooperates closely with cultural practitioners from various Borneo indigenous communities to create livelihood opportunities. So let us begin. Adrian, would you like to start with your first question to Mariam? Please feel free to build on each other's responses.
Hey, hello, good evening.
Good evening, Adrian. So great to meet you.
Hi, Mariam. Lovely to meet you. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. And you?
It's lovely. It's lovely. I was just going through the Atelier Masomi site for a moment, and it was just I guess it's so wonderful to see the work they've done through your experiences and your skills as an architect yourself. So I guess how does your architecture respond to the surrounding natural and cultural heritage in Africa? And related to that, like, how does it ultimately contribute to your heritage protection?
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question, Adrian. I think for me, it just comes from the fundamental fact that I think architecture should always be a response to our environment, right? At the end of the day, that is what gave birth to the practice itself. It was the need to shelter yourself, the need to protect yourself from the elements, perhaps, the need to create community, the need to house and protect that community. And so because of that, it goes hand in hand with a local culture, with local heritage. And distancing yourself from that automatically creates a problem because it creates issues of disconnect. It creates, issues of distance and ostracization, disconnect, especially from community. And so for me, practicing meant automatically having to get back to what was essential for a certain place, whether it's in Niger or in another country. The question that I'm really interested in is what is sort of the DNA and the story of that particular place so that I can figure out how it can be merged back into the architecture and in the environment in a way that would allow, I guess, the people who use the buildings to feel sort of in symbiosis with the environment, that we create. But actually, equally for you, I was looking at your work, and it was incredibly fascinating because I did not know anything about Parap and Takna, and I was just absolutely enthralled by it, and also incredibly impressed by how long and how young you were when you started practicing, and how that turned into sort of this engagement, in community and in the heritage. In Malaysia. And then I was wondering, as a younger practitioner also, what have been some of the challenges that you've experienced, as you've embarked, on this almost, just kind of, you have a very strong point of view, and sort of this embracing of the heritage and how would you say, the need to make sure that the heritage doesn't die, right? And so what were some of the challenges that you encountered?
Hey, Mariam, thanks for sharing that. I guess in a sense that I do relate to how you try to, represent what it is for you in your architecture as much as mine. I mean, The challenges, I guess, well, as what we're talking about at the moment is representation, right? So for myself, one I like to share and highlight is perhaps appreciation and appropriation. So coming from an island that is shared with tens or maybe hundreds of different indigenous community, and Borneo is basically a melting pot of culture and heritage. It's the third biggest island in the world. So oftentimes we are clumped into this blob of general outlook, be it from outside perspective or perhaps unfortunately our own locality. So I guess even when we get into the world stage, when one think of Borneo or Sarawak itself, you'd see in embroideries and colorful regalias and homes and so on, but the true nuances, true examples of our practice, be it songs or music or the other practices, is it felt like an accompaniment to when you get to bring yourself out there and you try to explain yourself, like, yes, I do this, we do that, and this is the true expression of our heritage. And I guess that's one of the challenges, is the stigma of perception that we've been represented, that we've been mentioned. Before you were even there, people were like, oh, the dude is from there. He's he's probably this. We're not at all. There's so much more. So I guess for me, when I do go and sing my songs and share it with everyone, with my elders and other practitioners, it's just to remind them that these are the kind of experiences that we're going through, and it gives them sort of an aspiration to tell the true story about people. So, sorry, but basically, that's how the general outlook is. That's how it is at the moment. But again, I guess relating to that, perhaps, or kind of for yourself, I guess. I think we could feel ourselves. I think we connect in this kind of a momentum. You know what I mean? So, what is it? What are the actions that could be taken? I guess maybe for African cultural or natural heritage, or maybe in the diaspora of Nigeria, perhaps, to gain enhanced recognition and visibility on a global stage. What needs to change, you feel?
I think it's very similar to what you were talking about, but one of the issues, that you notice, especially in architecture and other art forms related to it, are what you said. Number one is the lack of representation, right? So that is already, representation goes always a long way, and representation, not just in terms of the people that are put forward, but in terms of sort of variety in what makes up the architecture canon. One of the challenges for me and for people like me, from the continent, is that we learn a craft that is sort of embedded in a Western culture almost by default, so that you almost cannot learn architecture without learning only a Western way of looking at architecture, which means that the rest of the world is largely ignored. So that representation, not only in terms of the kinds of works that are studied, that are put forward in the canon of architecture, but also then that means automatically that there's a problem in the scholarship and what is available. And so one of the things that needs to happen is that other continents who are equally rich in architecture and in their heritage need to have the opportunity to be able to contribute to that scholarship, not necessarily having people from outside coming in and making the scholarship based on what they think they understand of the place, but really empowering local communities to contribute to that knowledge base for the rest of the world, and for other architects who would be, let's say for African architects, to be able to read a lot more about African architecture on an equal footing with other types of architectures from other parts of the world. And so for me, that was the biggest challenge, even as I was trying to become an architect and also as a practicing architect. to be able to surmount, because how do you make architecture that is for an African context when you had to learn the craft of making architecture based on European and American architecture, right? So that is definitely, you know, I feel like in a way also I'm echoing some of the challenges that you were talking about in terms of, you know, preconceived notions of what we think something needs to be, and realizing that we actually have to do a lot more work to unearth the truth of what it actually needs to be. And so actually related to that, you know, I understand that you're also a community manager, right? And sort of having these initiatives that you see through. And so how do you think that we can reach, you know, a certain form of empowerment, you know, of indigenous community, both, you know, economically speaking, you know, or even in terms of contributing to promoting the culture and heritage, because I feel like there's a lot of parallels, you know, also between what we're talking about from that point of view.
Yeah. Yes. I'm sorry, my connection is a bit lagging at the moment, but I hope you guys can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Could you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Oh, lovely. Sorry about that. Yes, that's, you know, it's so uncanny how the parallels of this this narrative we're talking about it's just, again, it's, I guess I'm falling about it, but it is uncanny for us in the Too Young initiative, working as a community manager. I guess it's more of we work with different communities. As I mentioned, there are tens or maybe hundreds. In Sarawak itself, there are over 38 different indigenous communities, and yeah, it's a lot. And we work with different practitioners from these communities, and through their unique practice, be it performing art or craft and others that I mentioned earlier. So we're highlighting everyone's heritage through their own narrative. So we strive for the inherent strength of each communities and work together with them in developing the skills. So through you know, industry partners or other social businesses, organizations, etc., etc. So rather than to invent the wheel or making them something they're not, again, like yours, it's we're not trying to take the methodology of what we're not used to. It's more of just harnessing the what we all have. It's for us art. It's a bit more well, I guess in a Western context or outside context, that beyond our community, perhaps it's more of it's a way of life. For us, art is not art because you live through it. These songs that we do, this music that we play, it's a part of ourselves. So economic empowerment in the sense that, so when we approach a practitioner from the community, we share advantages. Like, so from the Too Young side, we have these networks and all these industry partners that we can, you know, talk to, like, how do we elevate this? How do we go about this to share our culture and heritage, you know? And so, we develop that with the practitioners, and we develop that with everyone. Everyone gets a say. It's not that like, oh, okay, how about you do this, you do that? No, we do not do that. We go to the communities like, hi there, there's a potential in what you can do. It could go to a global state. Would you like to work with us? And what would it be like? You know, what would your end goal be like? I'm just gonna fix. So yeah, be it a painting, for example. You know, this beautiful paintings that you do. It could be turned into sort of a, I guess, for like a better example, you know, postcard. So and that person who created that painting, his name would be in there, represented, and he'd be on the front line. For us, that's the idea. The practitioner, the community, through that, we empower them through their own work economically. You know, when you've done, you elevate each other through all of these ideas. Yeah, it's so interesting to know that at the other side of the world, this is the parallel is just so uncanny. It's just the same, right?
We all have the same problem. It's the same problem.
Yeah, we all do. Yeah, I mean, I'd say I'd be so ignorant. Like I know maybe bits and pieces about Africa itself or the architecture, but knowing what you're telling me now, it's just, oh my God. You know, we feel so shelled about it is actually happening to everyone, especially like you know the localities, I guess, the diaspora, right? Yeah, it's interesting to know, and I guess it could be a potential in the future sort of collaboration, maybe.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes, in a way, yeah, it's about tackling different, the same issues from different practices and different sort of backgrounds, but at the end of the day, you're still trying to solve the same problem, even though the specifics of that problem might be different, which then makes for a really rich discourse at the end of the day, which is why, events like these are so amazing.
Exactly. So I guess so for you, how can public spaces be able to protect local heritage or foster a sense of community, like bringing everyone together and perhaps through what you do enhance the way of life? How do you feel about it?
Yes, this is actually, thank you for this question, because this is a problem or a question that I've been exploring a lot, in the sense that I started realizing when I came back to practice in Niger that even what we mean by public space actually can be different, right? When you're sort of in Europe or in America, often public space maybe might take the form of a park, or something like that, where people can go and have some fun or be together or be with family. And then I started realizing that here, specifically in Niger, I'm not talking for the whole continent, but specifically for Niger, public space is a much more complex and layered thing. And it really means all the ways in which you come together with community, with family, how you can informally come across each other. And that takes completely different forms from what we're used to seeing. It's not so much about having this structured park or something where people could be, but maybe it's actually in front of someone's home is the public space, because all of a sudden people drag a chair and sit there, and neighbors walk by and they stop by, they drag another chair, there's a tree there that gives enough shading that, all of a sudden you end up having 10 people congregating around one person's home and sharing something about the day, and it ends up going on until 3 a.m. And these are forms of public spaces that are not, once again, not necessarily in the canon of what we're taught, to make in architecture and as we plan for cities and for lives in community. And so I see kind of this unique opportunity there to expand what we even understand, for as public space, in order for it to really be by looking at the local heritage, right? Because looking at that local heritage and different heritages around the world allow us to expand that vocabulary and that tool set that we have on what constitutes a public space and how it functions and how it can serve a certain community. It's incredibly important to local heritage, because in the local heritage are encoded and embedded the different expressions of these public spaces, and then ultimately what you need to make for a certain community in order to enhance that community's life, in order to really sort of, rather than destroying a certain kind of equilibrium or cultural equilibrium that exists among people by ignoring these different, heritage or sort of, I wouldn't even say heritage, I would say the narrative of a place, right?
Yeah.
By really paying attention to that, then you actually end up, creating these spaces that truly empower, but without, focusing on what is there and what is needed there, it's virtually impossible to be able to do that. So it's something that I look at, a lot. And I actually wonder, because, you're both a musician and a performer. So do you see in the same vein, it's a very public sort of art form, right? And so do you see a parallel between, an intangible type of heritage like music or performance with a very much tangible physical heritage form like the built built environment. What do you see as parallels, you know, between the two? Like how could they be linked, for example, in your practice?
Yeah, that's a very good question. You know, as I mentioned earlier, this it's a part of our life that what we do, these practices and all of this. So intangible in the manner of structure or songs or music. It's for us. It's more of the reminiscing and being and feeling grounded to what you are, to who you are. Because when we sing the songs, it's when we talk of it, we draw our inspiration, is this metaphors, these poetic phrases from the nature around us, and we talk of it. We talk of our ancestral times, of how it looked like, how it used to be. So in that manner particularly, you know, and for us, it's something that we don't think that is disconnected between the two. Every part of your life is an essential catalyst to what you are doing. So yeah, everything comes together and it just flows like a river. Everything is just connected. You're just grounded. So yeah.
That's beautiful. And I want to say that I think we're going to need to stay in touch, because when I was reading what you were doing, it was, and actually what came, you know, the art form has parallels from my community. Yes, so we have something very similar. I'm from the Hausa people in West Africa. Hausa, yeah. And it's a language that actually has a lot of imagery and metaphor, where you can have entire conversations in metaphors and, you know, sort of, you know, imaged language. And I would love to continue the conversation and hear more about your work, because there's just a lot of parallels. It's also very performative, a lot of, you know, poetry and theater, you know, and all of that. Embedded sort of in the language.
Thank you very much. Art form.
Definitely.
I am very sorry to cut in. This dialogue had such a profound synergy, and you've together questioned the imposed narrative, be it, Adrian, you said art is not just art in your community, it's a way of life, it's what you live. And Mariam, you talked about, you know, public space in Africa is not what people might think when they hear public space. So there's a lot of synergies there, and I'm looking forward to connecting you two after this dialogue to see what comes of this dialogue in the future. Thank you very much. It is now time for our second dialogue. Our next panelists are Bahia Shehab and Kidlat Tahimik. So Ms. Bahia Shehab is an Egyptian-Lebanese multidisciplinary artist, designer, historian, and professor at the American University of Cairo. Her work is preliminarily concerned with identity and cultural heritage. She uses calligraphy and graphic design to raise awareness of feminist discourse and social issues in the contemporary Arab societies. And Mr. Kidlat is a Filipino filmmaker, writer, visual artist, and actor. A highly celebrated figure in the independent art world of the Philippines, his medium ranges from film and photography to freestyle architecture and installation. His films are centered around critique on neo-colonialism and globalization, while offering a premise of hope. As a longtime advocate for indigenous and local cultures, he has organized conferences for indigenous peoples around the world. So let's start by giving the microphone to Kidlat. As you know, this is an open dialogue. Would you like to pose your first question to Bahia? Go ahead, Kidlat.
Hello, Bahia. I'm sorry I only got your picture today, but I think my questions is probably now has to be reframed, because I see you are a multidisciplinary. I see you're a professor, you're a designer, you're a calligraphist. Ooh la la, all these multi skills. Of course, you're from the Middle East, and whenever I always read about all these conflicts going on there, and I think your advocacies for heritage through your various activities, how are these affected by these conflicts? I have a feeling that somehow, I mean, if I could imagine a missile from an enemy heading for your pyramids, I'm saying, oh my God, what's going to happen to that heritage? But surely with your own intangible arms, your own intangible ammunition from art, you must find a way to do these conflicts harm your heritage approach?
Thank you, Kidlat, for the question. Actually, yes, the worry about losing the pyramids, I think, is a global worry, not just for people living in Egypt. I actually grew up in Lebanon during the war, what people called the civil war. And we don't call the Middle East anymore. As historians, we refer to it as Swana because we believe that Middle East is quite a colonial term. So we are trying to decolonize the region in different ways. But to address your question, I lived firsthand during the war in Lebanon. So I really saw the physical destruction of tangible and intangible heritage and what it can do to society. So it can destroy the social fabric, it disconnects generations from each other. So children growing up with their parents or their grandparents and the extended family, and this really impacts their identity. We saw the extremism that was going out of Europe. This is because of the loss of identity, because people are disconnected from where they come from and they were uprooted from where they come from. So we also have the loss of lives leads to the loss of knowledge. And even when people are not killed, they are displaced. That breaks their ties with their society. And the knowledge that they gain or produce from and for that society is also lost. And that is also another big problem. The damage is also towards the educational and research infrastructures. And again, the chain of accumulated knowledge that is supposed to be passed on from one generation to the other is severed. And the more visible damage is the damage to the physical loss of heritage, God forbid the pyramids. But unfortunately, growing up in Lebanon, I did see the disappearance of, and now in Syria and Iraq, we saw in the region, unfortunately, Palestine, we have seen systematic erasure of our history. The minaret of Aleppo was a culmination that was bombed in 2013, was a culmination of Mediterranean heritage, not just Arab heritage. So it impacts all of us, not just people living in the region. And so this is irreplaceable, but in general, instability impacts world heritage in its many facets. But I would like to highlight the impact on culture with my question to you, because since your first feature film, Perfumed Nightmare in 1977, which was the year I was born, so it's 45 years old now. So I'm really honored to be talking to you about this. You have explored post-colonialism from the perspective of the Global South, which we both belong to. How does storytelling through these protagonists contribute to a balanced representation of history in your perspective?
Okay, those words, globalization and neocolonization, let me break away from that because those have already many connotations. Let me just answer by, okay, my connection and my appreciation of the old heritage that we have, and you were, I think the previous speaker, Kamara, was talking about the intangibles that are often endangered. No? Now, I think the starting point as an artist is not the theoretical frameworks, but it's, okay, start with a simple thing. I have been living with a tribe, the Ifugao tribe here, and they are the people who built the rice terraces 3,000 years ago. And just imagine like a stairway to the gods, but they're all green. They're all, well, depending on the season, they're green if they're planting season period. And when it's a harvest, they all turn yellow. Now these, all the kids in that area, they're taught, well, again, this is part of the curriculums. This is the 8th wonder of the world. Bravo, 8th wonder. And I said, oh God, that's a starting point that's wrong. Because some historians or somebody who framed the first 7 now says, you're the 8th. Is that correct? So we have to neutralize that starting point. And I tell the kids, hey, just know that this is the first wonder of the world. Maybe you're older than, maybe our rice terraces are older than the pyramids or the Great Wall of China. It's not a competition, but just think of it as first. And I think that's a good starting point when you start telling stories in your paintings or in your sculptures. And this is one way to start. The other way, I mean, I think a good example I have is, I like to start with the mythology because, you know, we're invaded with all these Spider-Man, Captain America, Wonder Woman, all these superheroes. And a lot of the kids, yeah, they know the middle name of Spider-Man and they know the birthday of these guys, but they know very little about they forget about their mythology. Now, one of my favorite stories is Inabian. Inabian is the goddess of the wind in Ifugao. And I have here, I hope we can see this. This is Inabian. She was on her, what do you call this, backstrap loom, weaving a piece of cloth, maybe a loin cloth. And the gods decided to test her and they started blowing her around. But because she had a backstrap, I don't know if you can see this, a backstrap like a seat belt. So she was blown out. But she survived the test because of that backstrap. And then the gods made her a goddess of the winds. So today, her name's Inabian. Whenever a typhoon goes to their village, they pray to her, okay? Oh, Inabian, please change the direction of the typhoon. Please spare our village. Now, okay, in my narrative, okay, I have here another representation of Inabian. She's the goddess of the wind. Hey, I need some lights. Here, she's the goddess of the wind and she's blowing. But in my new narrative, and this is one way to, she is confronted by another goddess of the wind. And guess who? Okay, the goddess of the wind of Hollywood. Everybody knows her. And maybe because of that international fame, maybe Inabian can ride on her fame. But in my narrative, that flowing skirt is coming from the winds of Inabian. And it's really saying, okay, we have enough of your Hollywood stories. We have enough of your Harvey Weinstein stories. Let us be, we have our own beautiful myths and tales that we can start with. And to make this a feasible thing, I have my, here's the indigenous cameraman with his loincloth.
Brilliant.
And he's shooting the story that now matters and does not follow the formula of the big story. These are little ways that I feel we have to get our young people curious again in their heritage. But
of course,
our whole, you know, the Philippines, we have had a long history of colonization. So one writer said, we Filipinos have lived 3 centuries in a convent and 50 years in Hollywood.
Yeah,
so that's 300 years of Spanish. And
it resonates with the Arab world, actually. I feel similar. There's a lot of parallels. We also have been colonized, actually. Yeah. I wanted to bring up this point of colonization and how it has damaged, again, this social fabric. And what you are doing is brilliant, because this is exactly part of the problem, is that we don't have our own narratives, our own stories. Our children have been reading and consuming this this Hollywood, as you said, narrative that is, shoved down our throat in movie theaters, on the radio, and for the past, in my region, 150 years. So how do you dismantle that? How do we break it down and make people more aware of the problem? Because some people don't see the problem. They don't see themselves as colonized.
No, you have to make them aware that there is something beautiful in our past, and what is cool coming from the West or cool coming from Hollywood.
Yeah, but how do you do that when you have huge machines working? You have huge media machines. In our case, we have also, our part of the world has been portrayed, if you were talking Hollywood, we have portrayed actually as the villains. So if you look at history of cinema and how the portrayal of Arabs, the big noses, the oppressed veiled women, they're coming to free us from, the patriarchy. So it's all of these narratives that really, people here think that blonde and blue eyes are more beautiful than brown hair and brown eyes, for example.
As a child, we used to watch those cowboy movies, The Lone Ranger and Tonto, his Indian sidekick. And all of us, we wanted to play the Lone Ranger because he was the hero with the blazing guns.
Of course.
And then, of course, he named his Indian sidekick Tonto, which actually is a racial slur. It means stupid. But we never realized that. But I think over the years, when we begin to see that our self-esteem has been affected by these racial stereotypes.
And so how do we build this? How do we build this awareness of cultural heritage for the future? I mean, we can have a discussion about this together. I have several ideas, but I would like to see your point of view. Of course, we're both in education. And education is key. This is where we start. But how can we think of other structures that we can tackle this issue? We found a parallel.
A lot of the young people who have already their parents had been brainwashed into this. It's cool out there, and we have to be like them. You have to break that by finding whether our stories are about Inabian and her fascinating ability to be a guardian of culture. I try to emphasize this symbolically, and maybe I can just add another visual. I always tell my students, hey, stop being copycats of Hollywood. Bring out your bamboo camera, okay? This is my bamboo camera. And in the village, this lower part is like a fish trap. And it comes in through one end, and you have it inside here. And when you want to get out the fish, you open the lens.
It's
and
beautiful.
It comes out. But it's a symbolic thing for the young people to say,
it's a very powerful symbolic tool. Very powerful.
We can tell our own stories.
Yeah.
The bamboo camera is from the POV, the point of view of our side. History has been told by Western historians, and we are so used to quoting page 8 of that book in that archive in the West.
Exactly.
And then we forget our own little histories, and maybe our oral histories
definitely
can themselves become part of our storytelling. And this is where we have to just dig a little bit deeper and not. But of course, the money people want to hire those directors who can do the Filipino Spider-Man.
They know more. The problem is bigger. Thank you for bringing this point. They want to hire the different the expert, the international expert. And I think our governments need to create awareness amongst our citizens. I think we should create awareness in our governments on the importance of preserving our tangible and intangible heritage, because it's only through this awareness that heritage is preserved. And so with all the narrative of decolonizing, I think we really need to start with our governments and go down from there. And then I think the international community needs to come in conversation with local communities to provide exchange of knowledge and access of knowledge and tools of cultural preservation. I think that the countries who have colonized have the responsibility now to support, return artifacts, and play an active role in addressing the damage that they have inflicted. And I think we need to build more infrastructures for the understanding of what heritage, disseminating of what cultural heritage preservation. What you're doing is wonderful. I would like to see that in schools all over the Arab world. I would like to see the awareness about cultural preservation in curriculums, and it needs to become part of our mainstream discourse. And it's only through knowledge that people will understand the value of heritage and its importance. And it's the role of government, the private sector, the education sector, the civil community. We should all come together and create a way forward. So
maybe in a field of your...
Yeah, and in that idea, I want to ask you a question. Do you perceive a disconnect between heritage and the creative industries or the private sector in the Philippines? And how do you think, in your view, can they work together to enhance the appreciation of heritage among domestic as well as international audiences? Because it's not just our image of ourselves, but also how we present ourselves to the world. Are we copycats, or do we own our identity and present it on a global platform?
Well, it's very tempting to be a copycat because you're always feeling
it's easy.
The curators there from that biennale or from that film festival is looking for the usual things that maybe impressed us as colonized consumers of their art products. And I think when we become that, there is a disconnect. And that's why the commercial filmmakers will do a Filipino Spider-Man or a Filipina Wonder Woman. And
it's the same in the Arab cinema. They take a Hollywood movie and they just translate it. The same is happening in our part of the world.
But maybe, for us, for the independent artists, we can try and bridge it in a way by saying, hey, we have our own stories, whether it's somebody like Inhabian, the goddess of the wind. We can put them in the forefront, and to make them something we can identify with. Of course, everything now is laser guns and all these magical. But if you humanize your mythological characters, which I think, Ms. Kamara earlier talked about metaphors, and our.
Ancient Egypt is full of gods.
Yes.
We have nothing but gods in ancient Egypt.
And our use of metaphors is so different from that precision that those image makers from the West try to make the blood more bloodier than it is. So we can find
very much.
We can find our ways of telling stories. Anyway, everybody smile. You're on Bamboo Camera. Let's leave this image with you. Nice to talk to you, Bahia. See you soon.
Thank you. Same here, Kidlat. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very lively discussion to Ms. Shehab and Mr. Tahimik, and really centered around taking back your own narrative, using storytelling for the future of heritage. Thank you very much for this. Now, it is time for our third dialogue. Our next panelists are Habiba Djahnine and Nicolas. Ms. Djahnine is a writer and a filmmaker. In her documentary, Lettre à ma sœur, Letter to My Sister, she denounces violence as a solution to societal disputes. Her documentaries reveal diverse facets of Algerian society and its history. She co-founded Association Kaina Cinema, a network of audiovisual and cinematographic sectors between Algeria and Mediterranean countries. Mr. Nicolas is a Swiss researcher, writer, design researcher, and anthropologist of technology. His work focuses on observing and documenting digital and new media practices and environmental changes. He's a co-founder of a near future laboratory, which takes on projects exploring how design can help make prospective scenarios through everyday artifacts. He's also a professor at the Geneva University of Arts and Design and an associate researcher at Media Lab Sciences Po in Paris. For those of you joining just now, it's simple. We're having an open exchange where panelists freely build on each other's response. The following dialogue will be in French, so please feel free to select English interpretation at the bottom of your screen if you would like to follow the conversation in English. So let's start by giving the microphone to Nicolas. Would you like to pose your first question to Habiba? Go ahead.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that you can hear the interpretation. I would like to greet you, Habiba. It is a pleasure for me to participate in this dialogue. Good afternoon. I discovered your work over the past few days, and therefore I have a few questions, maybe a bit candid, to ask about your work. I can see that you are a leading figure. You try to promote filmmaking in Algeria. And there's one thing that I think is interesting regarding the topic at hand, the issue of heritage, and it is directly related to my work. It is the importance of storytelling, the importance of telling stories, one can say. And therefore, what is the importance of this concept in your work, broadly speaking, especially when it comes to the recognition of heritage at the local, national, or international levels? Good afternoon. Well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure for me to discuss with you, Nicolas, and to listen to the previous speakers as well. Just to put things into context, this is an independent structure in Algeria. We created an alternative space where we could think with colleagues, filmmakers, and also activists. We think about the image, how we can build an image of ourselves, and therefore storytelling lies at the very heart of our work. As it was said by previous speakers, we live in a region of the world, North Africa, that was colonized for 130 years, and therefore we try to once again own our culture, and sometimes it takes place violently. There's also the problem of authoritarianism in our region, which means that we have to think constantly about the way in which we tell our stories. But also, as soon as we pick up a camera, how can we build an image of ourselves that is not alienated, that is free, that is independent, that is not polluted by the various misconceptions that we have of ourselves, and how, based on our practice, how can we go about looking at our heritage that is sometimes in the process of disappearing or of being cancelled. And there's also the issue of denial. To give you a very concrete example, if we talk about women, it is very difficult for women to speak up. They have a minority status in the law in Algeria, even though women are the bearers of heritage such as poetry or customs, habits, rituals, and documentary making and film making, as we want to practice it, will give them the possibility to tell their stories. It will promote their heritage, and sometimes it will also reconstruct something that is in the process of disappearing. And therefore, our approach is extremely dynamic. To put it simply, I would say that it is a very living approach. And when I say living, it means that it is inhabited by the people themselves. We are not talking about the past. We are trying to invest in the future through heritage, which I think is crucial. Because indeed, sometimes people have a narrow-minded way of looking at the past. And I think that the issue of alienation is fundamental. I was also looking at your work, Nicolas, and the digital is something that, in my view, and to many of my colleagues, is central. Because it is very difficult to live without new technologies nowadays. But because we try to think, we ask ourselves, how can we have a different approach? How can we use these new technologies without falling into the same trap? And as an anthropologist, as someone who is interested in transmission, I would like to know what your approach is. Well, thank you very much for this question, which I think is very interesting. When I give lectures, when people think of technology, people think that I will be standing up for technologies, that I will be promoting technologies, but actually, first and foremost, I am interested in human beings. I'm also an anthropologist, and this anthropological dimension, even though, of course, there are clear links with colonization, what I'm really interested in when I look at anthropology and technology is to understand how human beings use these technologies, a smartphone, for example, or the internet or video games, and the disconnect between the intent of the people who produce these technologies, and the way in which people will be using these technologies to do whatever they wish to do, to communicate, to tell stories, and of course, there are companies that are trying to impose their own goals. And so there's a problem of disconnect. There's the risk of alienation. There's the fear that we may lose our culture, our language, because very often it's directly related. A language can be imposed, and very often it is English. And in my work, more specifically, I look at some marginal everyday practices. I work in the University of Arts and Design. I work with designers who design a number of digital technologies, and I try to encourage them to look at the world, whether it is in Switzerland or in other countries around the world. I'm currently working with a colleague in Haiti, for example, on the issue of smartphones. And therefore, the people who use these technologies to meet their needs, how will they find an equilibrium between what is imposed by a technological company and their own needs, their own desires, the way in which they want to live? And there's a clear tension, contradiction, but I think that people always try to use these technologies as they want, which sometimes upset companies or states. It is important to understand this disconnect, to find new ways to tell stories, to communicate more discreetly. And I will end on this note, new ways to distance ourselves from asymmetric relationships, which sometimes have to do with issues of gender or ethnicity. Disadvantaged communities, there are always people who find a way to do it. And my goal is to try to understand the way in which they use technologies to find new ways to tell stories, new interfaces.
The question I think is interesting is How do we allow people to reappropriate their own story, their heritage, using the tools of today? And how can we use the tools differently? In other words, if we take cinema, documentary cinema, how can it be changed in order to tell stories in a certain way? Yeah, I think that's really what we're doing. And what's more, we've got a documentary film creation workshop that we've created because there's what we're doing is working in a workshop basis and bringing together people from different horizons from throughout the country who are not necessarily trained as artists. They don't have an artistic background. And I really think that's very important because the category of the population that isn't necessarily well-versed in the arts. It's also the question, what can be done in the context of the cinema schools? So what we're trying to do is to create spaces for creation, creative spaces, and how do we help people, support them, help them to look at their own realities? I think there's something that has to be borne in mind, and I'm sure everybody in the panel would agree. It's a question of the fact that our history and our heritage is losing value because of colonialism, neo-colonialism, and also the dominance of certain media. Previous speakers were talking about Hollywood, for instance. So all the structures throughout the world that are culturally dominant are shaping the way people see things. So there's a process of disappropriation and disalienating people, moving away from this so that we can look at things anew and get things right. In other words, look at things correctly. How, as men and women, can we go about what we're doing in a different fashion, using different tools? Digital tools make it possible for us to do things because it's not too expensive. You can do a lot with a smartphone and so on. So the question of new technologies means that we've liberated ourselves to a large extent and started down a new path towards a reappropriation of our heritage. I'm thinking of a young intern who made a film of a slum area, and what he does is he goes into that area, which is sort of despised by the rest of the population, and because of his way of looking at things and the way in which he starts to work with these people who've been pushed to the margins of society, he's going to bring back culture through music, through social solidarity, the way people live, things that most people don't know anything about. And it's in this way that we're trying to enhance the value of what we have. And also it's important to be collective in our approach, to share things, to work together with people. In other words, you're not making films about people, you're making films with people. And the population has to be involved in this. And for us, that's vital. I mean, it was not something we were necessarily aware of to begin with, but what we're seeing is that if we add up the different pieces of work, that's going to create the heritage of the future. Because what we're doing is seeing what people are producing. I mean, I think both of us are talking about transmission, and that's what we're doing. And I wonder how you see things, your approach to heritage, that takes account of these different facets. Because I think these sort of issues are not peculiar to what we have in Algeria. I mean, there are all sorts of populations that are pushed to the outer confines of society. And I just wonder how you see things. It's not necessarily absolutely identical, but if you're in a country such as Switzerland, I mean, from the outside, you know, it's a Western society, and I'm the representative of that society here on this panel. But there are all sorts of differences, different accents, different, in a city like Geneva, you've got people from all over the world, or international organizations. And I have students who are from all sorts of background, racial, cultural, national, Brazil, Japan, whatever, and people who've come from different horizons. I was listening to what you were saying, and I would say that here, even where I am, in a place like Geneva, there is a certain amount of irritation when I follow to the Alps, for instance. I've got a statue of the mountain devil here. I'm not necessarily going to show it on the screen. Anyhow, so there's a way of taking on board the stories from the past and reworking them. And in the context of transmission, there are two things that we should teach our students. That is to be open, to be curious. Behind the facade of a given person from a given country, there might be an awful lot more than meets the eye. Things are more complex than they appear. For instance, I mean, my grandmother was Brazilian. I mean, to look at me, who would know? So that means you have to pay attention to the other. That's part of curiosity. And then there's a second thing. You have to know how to observe and to listen. And to do it, to be a good human being, but also to be able to create. If I think of what you were saying earlier on and what you're trying to do, the project you talked about in Oran, and I see this myself with younger people, we have to teach them to observe and to see details that might seem irrelevant, but on the basis of those details, you can tell stories that are important for you. It can be linked to cultural aspects, music, history, things that speak to you. And very often that's been set aside because there was sort of a legitimate international culture, and people have lost sight of the fact that those sort of things can be really worthwhile. I mean, if I'm when I'm teaching, I observe the students. Why do they write in the way they write? I mean, all sorts of things. And it teaches you that things can be different, but you have to learn how to observe. It's not something that's made much of in our Western education systems. So openness, curiosity, knowing how to observe people, that's what's important. And I was also wondering, picking up on what you were saying earlier, I mean, we talk a lot about younger generations. If you see the way in which people see the world, tell stories, express concerns, emotions, fears, that there's a sort of fertile ground for further development. It's very interesting to hear all of this. We're always trying to take a look at design technology and see how we can work with it. It's a question not just of design, but it's also ethics. Ethics, that's crucial. So, well, first of all, our training it's for young people, for people under 35, 40. And year after year, we see that there's a real passion for history, for culture, for heritage, a desire to seek a certain truth and to move away from the official line, and how these small stories, minor stories, can tell the big story, history. One of our trainees came up with a film that actually was being shown in the cinema in 2022. She goes out. She was a shepherd actually to begin with, and she went to her mountain village, and she was working with shepherdesses who were continuing Nuba. It's an old tradition. So there's a group that's been created by these women, which means that they take it in turn to take care of the goats, the sheep, and the fields. And as they do it in turn, while that's going on, others are dealing with taking care of the children, taking people to the doctor or whatever. So it's a system based on solidarity. They also take care of women who are unwell, or women who have to take their children to go to school. So it's a sort of self-help system based on solidarity in the village. And it's a fantastic film. Aside from the fact that she's managed to capture this solidarity in this age-old system that had been forgotten, but it's been reintroduced by these women, she's also recorded the poetry of the women, the stories they tell, their gestures, and so on, their relationship to the land. They even go and clean the cemeteries, which are focal points for memory. I think it's just wonderful that these young people, young men, young women, are returning to this overlooked world. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this passionate interdisciplinary discussion. Thank you very much. And you talked about education, technology, and how those things are essential for the next 50 years of World Heritage. Now it's time for our fourth dialogue between Ms. Azra Akšamija and Mr. Ibrahim Mahama. Azra is an artist, architectural historian, and an associate professor at the MIT Department of Architecture. Her work is concerned with blending cultural heritage in order to spark the creation of new art forms and future heritage. She also researches the representation of Islam in the West, as well as the restoration of cultural heritage in the Balkans. As a director of the MIT Future Heritage Lab, she explores creative solutions to conflict and crises using art, culture, and technologies, and challenges the standardized humanitarian design in response to conflict and displacement. And Mr. Ibrahim Mahama is a Ghanaian visual artist and author. He transforms found objects and materials into works of art that explore themes of commodity, migration, globalization, and economic exchange. Mr. Mahama's large-scale installations use materials gathered from urban environments. He's best known for his installations that encase public structures with jute sacks, exhibited at Documenta 14 and the Venice Biennale. Mahama has set up an open access culture center, multi-purpose facilities, and research hub in Tamale for artists and community members. So let's jump straight into our fourth dialogue by inviting Ibrahim to pose question Azra. Ibrahim, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for creating this wonderful dialogue for these cultural exchanges. And I'm very happy to meet Azra. Looking at her work, there's a great sense of delight within it with regards to the sensitivities that are within it and also the questions that are posed within it. I believe as cultural practitioners, we're constantly trying to find questions and also trying to find ways in which we can somehow somehow achieve a certain sense of justice in a way that materials, ideas, and information is redistributed within the world. Is Azra here?
Yes, I'm here. Can you see me?
Okay. Yes, I can see you now.
Great.
It's always good to see the face and connect. Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you. I wish we could do this in person, but it's lovely to connect around the world.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I was looking. I was looking at the book, "The Design to Live." I was reading about the synopsis of it, and it really sounded very interesting about making this book that actually looks at the idea of refugees and also designing this book that somehow has the content of like using everyday objects or objects which will be ordinarily forgotten, and trying to find ways in which you can use it to design things. Though if someone is a refugee, it doesn't necessarily mean that in a way that they live, they have to live in a very inhuman way. Of course, one of the things that I've been thinking about significantly has also been about the relationship between people who are displaced, and also like in relation to ecosystems or objects or things like that. During the pandemic, there was an old building from the 60s in Ghana, which was built by former Yugoslavian architects in post-independence era in Ghana, which I had the chance to acquire. And we had to exhume the building, and we realized that there was a huge colony of bats that were living within this space. But the question at that time was that do we get rid of these bats, or do we leave them in the space? And we made the difficult choice of leaving these bats in the space. So at least we could find ways in which we could feed the bats, or we could redesign the space to allow them to be able to live more fruitfully within this space. So it was the question that I was trying to ask was that trying to extend, like in trying to produce like objects that somehow can allow for people to be able to live within new spaces and all that. How, as architects and also as artists and practitioners, how do we extend that beyond the human into, for instance, the objects in themselves, the ones that we are creating as artists and practitioners? Like, what's the relation? Like, what I think it's an easy question, but I guess I'm struggling to ask it. Like, what is our relationship with these objects that we are making, like within this world that we are creating these for?
And are you asking this in relation to my own work, or what? You mentioned
no, generally, generally, not just in relation to your work, but in relation to like a global conversation context.
Well, I think we are all, embedded in a certain deeper histories and a kind of cultural context in which we live. So regardless what we are making, we are always building on top of experiences and knowledge that was pre-existing in science. And so all of that surrounds us, the culture, the exchanges, the handed down knowledge informs our making. And at times that, the informed knowledge has its own baggage. And I think for us artists and architects, especially people who are trained or who dedicate their time more deeply to reflecting also on that production, it is the task to think about what exactly is being reproduced, or to what end are we making these things, and what are the kinds of narratives that are maybe being perpetuated out of these artifacts, what are the power dynamics that come with them, and what is our role in them. And that's something I always ask myself, because as you are moving to different locations, working on your own work, but also studying cultural heritage and practices of other people. This is really an important question. And how do you think about this? You work. Sorry, it's my dog. Pandemic puppy. So yes. You work often with found objects and transform them. I will put for the. So you work often with found objects and transform them in large-scale installations. And could you talk a little bit about heritage and how that interaction with the material, but the site also informs the contemporary expression and contributes to safeguarding of that heritage that you work on?
Well, when it comes to the heritage ideas, I've always found different ways of interpreting it. So for instance, when we were in school, one of the big questions was how, as artists, and not even just as artists, as cultural practitioners, because the label of being an artist sometimes can be a baggage, which somehow already allows you to think that you understand art and the role of it, and you try to produce art. Whereas we are not trying so much to produce art, but we are trying to let art, the history of it, lead us in many possible directions. So for instance, the building that I was talking about, the idea was to exhume, to take soil that was embedded within this building for years, something that would have been either destroyed or thrown away, and to realize that each and every single constellation within these spaces was of a significant cultural heritage, even the soil that was in the ground. And by exhuming the soil from the space, it somehow allowed us to come back to this concept of the void, like in a more philosophical, but also in a very material sense. And that could lead us, for instance, into into these forest spaces, sacred lands in around Ghana, for instance, in the north, where historically there were kingsmen, tribal leaders that were buried in these spaces. You go into them and you find that there are maybe certain types of trees that were planted within these spaces, which people there believe that, oh, maybe their ancestors, the spirits of their ancestors dwell not just within the land, but they also dwell within these plants. So those questions for me were very important as to how they would, as to how they influence people living within that, within those spaces, and how it has influenced them from one generation to the other, in a more from a more ideological perspective as to issues regarding climate change. They are not cutting the trees within those areas because they believe that there is some kind of proximity to the spirit. So for me, I thought that it would be interesting to somehow draw that to the issue of the contemporary, because in contemporary art or in modern art, in the way that we think about it, there's always this kind of disconnect to historical forms and also historical traditions and all that. And as to what we consider to be heritage in a way, because there's always this thing, like in the beginning, that some of the participants were talking about these new kind of cultural forms that have been created by the West, whereas a lot of younger people are beginning to forget about their connection to their histories and heritage and all that. So for me, I think that it's somehow very interesting for us to be able to, create connections between like different timelines and all that. And within these connections, you can find everyday sites, forest areas, and all kinds of other spaces that do, that do speak to us within that. I believe so. Yeah.
I have blended in here an image of the Syrian refugee camp in Jordan called Azra,
yes.
Where you see a replica of the World Heritage Site Palmyra that is kind of replicated in a contemporary form through mud and pieces of cement that person has found in different locations. And I'm bringing this in also in this conversation when I think both you and my work touch on questions of ethics of preservation and what exactly is being restored and how we deal with these kind of multi-layered histories, but also displacement violence that are imposed on people and their heritage, right? And how is that brought up by contemporary forms? So here, this example, and
yes, I can see it
if I move my head, it's such a powerful example of a contemporary form that I think for me sums up in a nutshell of what preservation of cultural heritage should be about. It is a form of cultural shelter, right? So you see in the background these standardized shelters of humanitarian aid that are, functional, but they are meant to function in terms of efficiency to provide a roof above the head and kind of safety from weather and safety from violence. But the other part of the shelter, the emotional and cultural dimensions, are neglected in many cases in refugee camps and in the humanitarian sector. And for people fleeing from war and violence, and when they get stripped of their memory, identity, history, and they become a number in this like vast place that is, seeing them as a kind of, I need to give you food and shelter, and that is your life. This type of heritage provides a sense of dignity, I would say, and you can see it really in this image where this person, why are they, they have nothing to eat, they have future, but they are building this thing in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the desert. Why? And I think this image tells us that like what is really important for people is this also sense of identity and dignity, and heritage preservation can play an important role to address the needs of these people, to address the healing, for example, and also inspire future generations to go back or connect and have a kind of more hopeful future.
Yes, but I guess when we're thinking about these things, majority in the world, we never really think about the future really in relation to these generations when we're making these designs, because as you said rightfully, it's more the question of finance and economics is also what the very center and the heart of it, because it's one of the questions that I always asked myself when I was working, because most of the problems that we have in the world, it comes down also to economics in terms of how capital circulates and all that. Because you think that someone just needs food, they should be grateful enough that they are just alive and then they have not been erased from existence. For instance, there was a project that we're working on in Ghana, and we needed some materials from a global company for part of the workshop. And then when we wrote a letter to them, they wrote back to us saying that, oh, we cannot give you this material. We only give it to like very, very poor communities. And then I asked myself, are these poor communities, are they going to swallow this material? I realized that a lot of these people, probably they don't even have, they might not, a lot of these spaces where these materials go to, the economic conditions within these spaces might not even allow for these constellations that you're talking about to happen, rather than focusing on, let's say, building and sustaining like sustainable communities and like investing into infrastructure in a way that somehow allows for us to go back to the preservation of memory and taking memory and somehow thinking about it in more cultural forms and all that. So there were more or less like struggles within that that kind of relation, and you see it happening just all around the world. But as architects and as artists, do you think that we have a much greater role to play? For me, I think that I think of it more from a political angle, rather than, of course, I know that the aesthetics is also very important, but politically, how does we as architects and artists, specifically cultural practitioners, also contribute towards a shift in this? Do you think that we need some kind of a global alliance with regards to like cultural practitioners that also somehow come back to this conversation that we're having?
Yeah, I mean, there are many existing global alliances, but like, one is what can you do as an individual and what can you do as a kind of in alliance with other people. I think as individuals and experts in the kind of cultural production, let's say, whether one is an artist, architect, experimental heritage preservationist, I mean, there are many things one can do, and to kind of, as an individual, elevate the voices of those who are not heard, right? To make things visible, to uncover certain histories that have been downplayed, marginalized, and heard, facing the facts and making that somehow visible. I mean, that is a skill that we get trained in, and the power of the image. It's not about aestheticizing the story, but it's really about the kind of bringing the voice out and making things visible, and then making it also legible, right? For policymakers, for people to kind of appreciate and understand why is this even important? Why is it important to talk about heritage? Who cares? Who benefits from its preservation? And that, of course, comes in with our own sense of, I think we need to be speaking to each other and checking each other also in terms of like ethics of practice, right? So what kinds of biases and power dynamics we are bringing in as people engaged in the field. You may have expertise in one, but like, does that mean you inevitably should be the one doing that work, or should you be facilitating work that others who don't have access should do it, right? So these are also, I think, important questions. And then thinking about the future of heritage, I think, especially for those of us creating artifacts at present, it is about thinking that this might become heritage in the next 50 years. So what does that mean? Thinking with the pyramid of that, environmental consciousness and a kind of global community consciousness, and how my consumer behavior impacts someone on very remote part of the world.
Yes.
I think as individuals, this is where we can play, but of course, global alliances, I mean, forums like UNESCO are important to be part of, and you know, many others. I mean, you have founded the Savannah Center for Contemporary Art, where Ghanaian artists can explore their mediums freely. Maybe you can talk also about that center in relation to its kind of global mission.
The Savannah Center for Contemporary Art in Tamale was, I started thinking about that as a student, because my background as a student came from this kind of Marxist position of already thinking about the idea of equality as a starting point, and also this idea of redistribution through the work that we do. How do we as artists become this kind of cultural agents that constantly thinks about precarity, the crisis within the world, failures, and the conditions, the inherent conditions that we have in the world, to think that globally, all of us, we are like inherently, we are in a precarious situation, because people always like to think that, oh, we are the first world country and these people are the ones who are suffering. Like, no, the world is deep, it has been in a lot of trouble for many centuries, but particularly, even if we're looking at the last, let's say, century or so, there have been many issues. We've had 2 world wars, we've had a Cold War, we've had famine and hunger, we've had many different forms of crises that have happened within that time. So as artists, if we have the chance to be able to, for instance, produce work that we know that can influence any society, how do we do it? And for me, and for my generation coming from the university, we thought that social infrastructure was one thing that was important. So building an artist studio that acts as a place where preservation and all kinds of things happen. So for instance, we've done retrospectives of older artists, and those retrospectives are almost seen as archaeological excavations in a way, because you have artists who've spent their life's work and time producing ideas, knowledge forms and all that, but due to lack of state support in building cultural institutions and all that, none of these things ever are understood or are transmitted to other generations in terms of creating this kind of cultural and heritage relevance. So I thought that it was somehow important to create this space that would allow for another generation to be able to inherit something from the past, but at the same time, use that as a portal to create something for the future. Because we from the global South, imagine if most of the work that we make, most of them end up in Western institutions. So you go to the museums in the West and you find that, oh, they have collections from all around the world. But on the continent, you could barely find contemporary art or modern art institutions or whatever there are. So I thought, even at a very early age, it is important to already start building these cultural legacies by building institutions that preserve the life's work of people or artists from the very beginning. So in the next 50, 100 years, if I'm not, when we are no longer there, at least by then in the future, we are already creating like these cultural institutions from the beginning, which is something that is going to last a lifetime and go many generations ahead. And you can link that not just in relation to the work that we do, but we connect that to ecosystems, to bringing spaces back to life, intervening within already existing cultural spaces. Like there was a project I was interested in recently, which was going to these forts and castles and other heritage sites, taking molds, using soil from those spaces to create new cultural objects or things like that. So in a way—
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ibrahim. Sorry to
You're
cut
very
in.
brutal.
I could ask my dog to make the transition.
Exactly.
Sorry about this, but this was really funny.
Matilda
it's
is
a
like
new reality we live in.
It's an unpopular task, but someone has to do it. So thank you very, very much to you both. You have shared that heritage is a source as well as a sense of identity and dignity. That's a fantastic perspective. Thank you for that. And with that, we move on to our fifth and the last dialogue with Rita, Keegan, and Laura Yawanawa. Ms. Rita Keegan is an American archivist and multimedia artist based in the UK. She has experimented with new media as part of the British Black Arts movement. She often approaches the subject of memory, history, and adornment of Black artists. She recently held the first solo exhibition at Fire Station South London Gallery, exploring the intersection of new media experimentation, feminist practice, and the Black arts movement of the 1980s. Ms. Laura Yawanawa is a Mixtec Zapoteca activist originally from Oaxaca, Mexico. She's the president of the Yawanawa Socio-Cultural Association dedicated to Yawanawa people of Brazil. She heads a Yawanawa fashion line inspired by indigenous designs as an alternative economic livelihoods for women. She's also committed to triggering change towards an open and inclusive community where women achieve their full potential. So let's start by giving the microphone to Laura. Would you like to pose your first question to Rita?
Yes, sure. Thank you so much for this dialogue. It has been very enrichful to meet all the speakers. It's very amazing the work that everybody is doing, and I'm so happy to meet Rita Keegan. I'm very impressed for the work she's doing with to appreciate the Black artists, especially the women. Rita, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Well, very nice to meet you. And so you are a trained archivist, and so how can documentation and archival work contribute to the celebration of culture and heritage of Black women?
Well, I'm not a trained archivist. I came at it by accident. I was involved in a women's organization, and it was at a time when there was lots of exhibitions and things, and they were acquiring ephemera, and they felt that it was important that a woman of color dealt with it. And I'm also dyslexic, so it was, how do I approach this thing that can be incredibly daunting? But when I talked to librarians and other archivists, they said, you know, do it as simple as possible. So I thought, well, I know my alphabet, so I would start with that. There's also a combination of the ephemera that sticks with you and the ephemera that you collect. Collecting catalogs, you collect, you don't necessarily know it's important, but you know that it was a great experience. So you turn around and you have boxes and boxes of things. But with paper and catalogs, it was very easy with the plastic sheets that you could put in the catalog, the any kind of information about it, possibly a press cutting, and then put it in a folder. So a lot of it came about what was easy for me to collect and what could sustain in the various ways that I have had to live. But collecting ephemera, collecting objects is another thing, because you need the space for objects. Now, as you can see in the back, I am a collector of objects. Every country I've gone to, or every place that, you know, and I am a magpie, shiny. Ooh, I have to take it. But you have to, it depends on whether you can carry that with you. And I know that you must have, it must be very difficult to decide what you collect, especially with indigenous people. Do you collect objects? Do you collect ephemera? Do you collect, how do you collect the knowledge? And do you have a problem with collecting objects? Because sometimes the objects are so linked in with the process of indigenous people. I know that when I went to Ghana, I was in the market in Kumasi and I bought a little hand loom. Now that, I can't use it, but it was so important for me to collect the means of production. And I know that you would have very similar objects. So
Yes,
how do you approach this?
Yeah, here in Brazil, oral history, we don't have, well, in Mexico we have objects, but here the transmission of culture is more through the oral stories, our stories, and yes, our art through the singing, and also producing certain things like ceramics. But most of the story comes from our cosmovision, from our cosmovision about nature, about the forest. We believe very much in the spiritual world of the forest. That's where it comes, the knowledge to us, like in our stories, we have the animals that teaches us about the medicinal plants, that teaches us about how we should behave. We have all these stories that relates to basically to nature, to the animals, to the moon, to the sky, to the rain, to the sun. So we are very much connected with the spiritual world that is more, it's not really like collecting a material thing, so it's more collecting the stories and passing it to the new generations. So that's our main goal, to, at least in our work with the Yawanawa, we have been working very hard to really bring that back in the children, in the new generations, to really value more our stories, our traditional stories, and value more, our cultural manifestations. We have been working very hard on this in the last 20 years, because this was almost lost, because of colonization, because of many influences from the Western world. Yes.
I understand. I mean, being on the other side of that, being a child of the diaspora, coming out of a tradition where most of those things were completely lost, especially within the African American community and the Afro-Caribbean community. And being, I grew up in a city. So my relationship with the land is something that has been something that has not necessarily been natural, and it isn't necessarily a natural, but you try to investigate your truths and your cultural links. And I think a lot of the work has been to try to rediscover those links, try to rediscover the spirit, and the spirit that still resides within the people living in a different environment. And as I was listening to a lot of the talks, a lot of them held true just as much for the center as they do for the outside. And and that lack of ownership and that lack of self, and also with young people, how do you give them a sense of self where you can't give it to them, you have to offer them. And it's like a dinner, you offer this plate and they can pick out, but at least they're being offered history, they're being offered stories, and I think people's oral history, and even if it's the migration of oral history, because you don't realize how much you've taken from your cultural history.
Exactly. And yeah, so in our case, we have been working very much on that, on valuing our own knowledge. And at the same time, trying to use our knowledge for also, bringing economic means to our communities. Because to me, now in the world, there are so, our knowledge, our indigenous knowledge is being, misused a lot, by enterprises. They take our designs and suddenly they are in big stores, and nobody knows where it comes from. It comes from native people from Mexico, from the US, from Brazil, or even Africa. And indigenous people, we never are compensated by this. We are never recognized where those designs, that are so meaningful to us come from. And so I think, being in this conversation, in this dialogue, it's so important, to protect that knowledge, to recognize, that where it comes from. It comes from indigenous people's art and knowledge, and it should be recognized, and maybe even through laws, local laws or the state laws. So it should be a work of everybody, the state, the people, and like we have also developed partnerships sometimes with enterprises that use some of our designs, and they use it in some clothes, but with permission, and they compensate our people. And so that's what it should be done, and that everybody should recognize that, and that there should be laws or whatever that can protect the indigenous knowledge and the appropriation of so much, even songs, even sometimes I hear Yawanawa songs being sung, I don't know where, and it's not even recognized that it comes from the Yawanawa. It's Yawanawa. So, and what are they doing with these songs? Are they reproducing it? Are they making money with it? And it's very sad what happens with the appropriation of our indigenous knowledge.
Well, I mean, we see that here in the cities, and we see our cultural product being taken, being changed, being altered, and and I guess the disrespect starts in the source. It starts from not respecting the land and not respecting other cultural traditions, and diminishing those traditions and saying they're not important. I think that those issues need to be addressed, and that there's one fact, but there are many truths, and the different truths affect different people, and it costs nothing to acknowledge where the creativity came from, and it only brings greater knowledge and a more holistic understanding of the world. I think that those things are really important, and that the means of production don't come out of our hands, that we get acknowledged, and which only means that we can create more. And those things are parallel, and that's what's sometimes quite shocking, that our experiences are parallel as not part of the dominant culture. How the dominant culture disregards our makings, our creativity, our our talent, and it is just seen as another resource to use. And that's why the ownership of being an archivist, it means that you can record these things. I think that's crucial.
Thank you very much for this fantastic final dialogue, Ms. Keegan and Ms. Yawanawa. We're at the end of the last session of 50 Minds for the Next 50. Thank you to the audience for following these 5 sessions, which brought us new perspectives on the future of the World Heritage. Let us invite back UNESCO Assistant Director General, Mr. Ernesto Tone, for his closing remarks.
No. Okay. Yes, Matilda, I cannot have the screen because I have not the authority. So you can hear me, but I cannot see me.
Okay, I ask the technical
I don't need to be seen,
turn on the... We can hear you loud and clear. So you can go ahead and we will turn the camera as we go.
Okay. So Matilda, thank you so much. I was, yes. Now you can see me, I suppose. Yes. Okay, thank you. First of all, let me tell you that it has been a very wonderful last meeting of the 50 Minds. I believe that there was a lot of very important issue that was raised today on how we can focus more on the human-centered and environment issues in our future vision of what should be World Heritage List. Thank you all for this rich and dynamic session. Over the last 2 hours, we have discussed how we can move towards a more balanced, inclusive representation of World Heritage sites. And if you allow me only to summarize some of the intervention, Mariam Kamara emphasized that the very understanding of public space needs to be revisited by examining local heritage communities and their ways of life. By giving space to such narrative, public spaces can empower communities. The indigenous artist, Adrian and Milang, drew our attention to the current disconnection between tangible heritage and intangible heritage, like music. In his world, everything comes together and flows like a river. As an independent filmmaker from the Philippines, Kidlat Tahimik urged us to shift the focus from retelling popular stories to celebrating local narratives and heritage. He said, we have our own stories and heroes, distinctively different from image makers from the West. Bahia Shehab said, education is a starting point to raise awareness about heritage protection. Civil society, private actors, international communities, and government must all work together to create this awareness. Echoing this, Nicolas Nova underlined the importance of teaching tolerance among young people. There is a lot more than meets the eye. Things are more complex than they seem. We need to show them how to observe and appreciate it, to be open and curious, going beyond the facade of a person or a country. Habiba Djahnine highlighted the link between storytelling, women empowerment, and heritage protection. Documentary filmmaking can give women the opportunity to show and participate in their heritage, as well as preserve and reconstruct something that is at risk of disappearance. During the digital session, an Indian futurist, Djahnine, said, knowing our heritage allows us to make better decisions about our future. And the Polish environment activist, Malgorzata Gorska, said, during the climate session, we need to treat natural habits as something of high value, as a need for humanity. Salim Abdul Karim, a South African public health leader, taught us the word Ubuntu. I exist not as an island and not in a vacuum. I exist because you exist. These words can inspire the shared approach to heritage protection of tomorrow. Finally, today we see Laura Yawanawa and Rita Keegan, who spoke about something that is the first time that it is so open about misappropriation of knowledges and traditions that alternate some of the original expressions, that there is no respect, and it goes in the dementia of indigenous knowledge and communities. So let me thank all the 15 minds that were present during more than 2 months in this debate on the next 50. As you can imagine, it has been a hard work. I want to thank all the team of UNESCO, especially Matilda, who has been in charge of coordinating all these long process, and many people that work with her. It has been a pleasure to share with all of you. It's important that you know that now we are summarizing everything that was discussed, and the idea is to put it also during next meetings that will happen for the celebration, because what we wanted to reach with this was a different approach on World Heritage sites and on the World Heritage Convention. People that can get together to speak about what is the vision of what we want, of what people that normally are not the expert, are not expert in heritage, in tangible heritage, but they are preoccupied. They want to see grown all these heritage sites in a more harmonic way, in a more integrated places, where the community are not only the principal owner of these properties, but also the one that give the value to these places. So thank you so much. It has been a pleasure to be with you, and we hope very soon to have more minds for reflecting on the next 50 or beyond. Thank you, and until the next time we met. Bye.